Hello, everyone. This is Trip. I'm here with Diana, and this is the special bonus Patreon Saints episode of Empty Altars.
Yeah, I'm excited about this. We get to talk about our own patron saints.
I know being a Baptist, the patron saint, I was like, isn't that the kind that are even more Catholic than just saints? I had to Google, what it was, and it's fascinating to read some of the explanation about a patron saint when you're explaining it in catechesis to for Catholics. And there are a number of different ways, but they talk about there's sometimes they're attached to a place, a patron saint's attached to a place or a vocation or these kinds of things. But for an individual, the language is all around a deep attachment to the particular passion of the saint for their own life's direction.
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting tradition. My grandmother, who was, I think, born nothing, none of the above. Both of my mom's parents were sort of a-religious in the 19 teens. They were born in the sort of the early flow of the 20th century sort of atheism, agnosticism. And so, but my grandmother, when she was a young girl, probably about 12 or 13, she decided she wanted to become a Roman Catholic. And so one of the things she did is she had to pick saints' names when she got confirmed as her patron saints. And so she was born Lillian Kraut. And when she got confirmed as a Catholic, she picked two saints, Saint Marguerite and Saint Irene, I guess their names were, because then she had four names. So she became Lillian, Irene, Marguerite, Kraut. And the Marguerite and the Kraut is like, I don't think those fit together very well. But so she had all these names, and eventually she left Catholicism too because it just didn't stick. But she liked having the names, and she told me about that when she was, much older. I said, "Why do you have four? Why do you have two middle names, Mimi?" And so she told me the story. And I always kind of like that tradition because, I mean, my name, there's no Saint Diana. I can guarantee that. All that Diana is the goddess in the book of Ephesians that led the Ephesians astray. So,
Oh,
um,
yet there's not a Saint Diana yet.
no, there isn't a Saint Diana yet. And there's my middle name was actually Lee when I just used my regular old fashioned middle name. And that was just because it went with Diana, and it was popular in the 1950s to give girls the middle name Lee. It's like no patron saint. I had to pick mine.
Oh, well, this is a fun. I mean, I think it'd be fun one because I don't know about you, but going throughout Lent and then just narrowing down the list of people we'd pick, and then digging into a couple individuals' kind of stories and thoughts and life and such each week. I mean, it's been energizing and exciting. And when we were discussing it, and we both realized that we each had someone that would occupy way more than our ideal 15 minutes and was uniquely important for our own self-understanding, not just the saints we want to inherit and pass on and such, but are unique and personal to us. So that's how we ended up with this bonus episode.
Yeah, we wanted people to think about the same thing. Who is a kind of sainty hero for you? Who's a mentor you may have actually known, somebody who's not famous, or who's someone who is well known in the Christian tradition who's influenced you in a particular way. So I thought it was going to be a really fun idea to have at the end of our time together a chance for us to maybe be a little like my grandmother and pick a patron saint or two to identify in your life, and someone who can maybe continue to serve as a guiding light. And
Mhm.
perhaps you've changed your mind over your lifetime too. That sure is a possibility.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so you want to go first?
Oh, sure. This
And
is pretty informal for me. when I was doing the class and we would talk about things, I literally would spend a lot of time on the weekend, reviewing the figures that I was looking at and looking up all sorts of stuff that they'd written and finding great quotes that I could share with the group. But this part being a bit more personal, I just thought I would talk about two people. There's my grandmother's heritage, that really have served as as a pair almost of patron saints, and they're people I knew and people I worked with who passed away within just a few months of each other, and those two people are Marcus Borg and Phyllis Tickle. And, when I think about my life in the last 25 or so years, I literally cannot think about what these working years would be had I not known them both, and the incredible impact that they had on me as friends, and also as, mentors. And it's interesting because Marcus and Phyllis kind of knew each other, but they never, from my understanding, worked together really closely. And I'm not even entirely sure that they liked each other terribly much. That would be something we'd have to ask, someone else, but I know that they certainly had, some theological disagreements. But for me, each one of them appealed to a different part of who I am and how I do my work in the world. And from I'm trying to remember which one of 'em I met first. I know I met Phyllis first. Um, and I had recently moved to Memphis in 1997. I was pregnant with Emma. For people who know my story, I'd been through a first marriage. I was in my second marriage. Richard and I got pregnant really quickly and very unexpectedly. And we moved from Santa Barbara to Memphis, Tennessee for me to teach at Rhodes College. And so I show up in Memphis, with my new husband, and we move into this house that's right near Rhodes, and we literally launched into an entirely new life. It was only a couple months after Emma was born, and there I was teaching at Rhodes, that I was invited to a dinner party, at a friend's house. This is a person we met at our church, and, so baby Emma, Richard and I go over to this lovely home, that was in a beautiful neighborhood in Memphis called Central Gardens, and we're sitting around the dinner table, and people are introducing themselves, and the host sat me next to Phyllis, and I literally almost fainted because at the time of all these years ago in the late 90s, I was still writing a column for the New York Times Wire service on religion and culture. And Phyllis was a hero of everybody who wrote in religious journalism because she had only fairly recently, within the last decade, founded Publisher Weekly's religion section, which had not existed until she imagined this idea of really putting out great reviews, with religion books at the during the 90s. And the section of Publishers Weekly that did this literally exploded. Um, the 90s were a very strong period of religious publishing, and there were all kinds of amazing authors writing remarkable books, that are still all over my shelves in my office. Memoirs, spiritual guides, great histories of Christianity, wonderful books about Jesus, lots of stuff about biblical criticism. And an enormous number of those books made it into the New York Times bestseller lists. And Phyllis was, in certain ways, responsible for that because she really pushed the market for these books and developed a market for these books, as well as being a person who covered religious events. And so there I was at this dinner party, and the host sat me next to this woman who was famous, in the field of religion journalism and in religion publishing. And and the thing that was so lovely about that conversation, was first of all, she was just enormously friendly and funny and witty and warm and all of these things. But I was so surprised because when I introduced myself, she goes, "Oh, I love your column." And so she actually knew my work. And this was before I had published a book, except for my dissertation. But she had seen what I was doing in the New York Times. And she said, "Let's talk." And that's what happened is during the dinner party, we hardly talked to anybody else. We literally talked to each other. And then we talked on the porch afterwards. And, it became really an incredible, friendship where she encouraged me at a time when I sort of wondered what was going to happen with my own career because there I was on sort of the takeoff ramp, as it were, when I was in my late 30s, and then all of a sudden everything changed, new job, new family, new baby, new house, new city, all of this sort of stuff. And I felt like what I had built, was disappearing. And certainly I didn't have the energy or the time that I had had to devote to my career and traveling and doing all the things that I had been before. And Phyllis just sort of calmed me down and taught me how to look at the world that was immediately around me and to observe where the spirit was working, just sort of on my front porch, and I've written about that in Freeing Jesus, and then she would say things occasionally like, "Don't worry, Diana, when the time's right, you'll be back on airplanes." When everything is the sort of the right moment, you'll get that book contract. And so she just sort of encouraged me to both enjoy my life as it existed, to keep doing the work that I was doing, and to build toward whatever would come. And she wound up being a big part of that, with and for me, because eventually when I did write a book that would be reviewed in Publishers Weekly reviews, Phyllis wrote the foreword for it, and it was literally the nicest foreword that I've ever had written for any book that I have written. Um, it's in Strength for the Journey. It's well worth reading. She she very nicely, attributed to me the invention of a new kind of genre in the writing of spiritual memoir, and I had never thought about that is a possibility for myself as a writer, being a real writer who would have command of a genre of writing, and that it would be something I would develop over time and that other people might emulate or even emulate and copy, which is actually what has happened with a lot of my work, which is incredibly humbling and delightful. And so anyway, Phyllis was remarkable in that way, and she was as old as my mom. So I had this kind of mom figure there for when the time when my daughter was little. We would spend a lot of time talking about families. We'd spend a lot of time talking about babies. Very nicely, she thought that I was younger than I was, and so I remember this one conversation we had, and I said, "Oh, Phyllis, I just don't know how I'm gonna be able to do this, Here I am, a baby boomer, and I've got this little teeny kid." And she looked at me and she said, "You're a baby boomer?" In this deep Southern Phyllis Tickle sort of accent. And I said, "Yes, I was born in 1959." I said, "What did you think?" She said, "Oh," she says, "I don't like baby boomers. I don't even like my own baby boomer children." She said, I thought sure you were Gen X." And I just remember laughing so hard at that. And I said, "Well, Phyllis, some of us are just born a little bit out of time." And she said, "Well, you keep that up, honey," And I just was no matter what she said to me, there was almost always this element of surprise to it. When I found out she was a playwright, when she shared with me poetry she wrote, I had no idea that that was part of who she was, until much later, in our friendship. And I guess the other thing that I want to say before I mention something about Marcus Borg, that is true was true about Phyllis, is that after my books began to be published, people started asking us to do things together. And the capacity that she had to just put her arms around a younger writer and bring me along for the fun was enormous. And so I think that one of the real highlights of my life was the year, I believe it was 2012. I had to look this up, um, about 2 months ago. I have to go and check it again. So it was at least a decade ago, probably more like 12 years ago, when the pair of us were asked to come and speak to the Episcopal House of Bishops. And, she was just beginning at that point to talk about the thing that would become the book, The Great Emergence. And I was talking about what would become the book, Christianity After Religion. And there we were with just the utter attention of the couple hundred people who were at the House of Bishops meeting in Camp Allen in Texas, talking about the future of the church and what these leaders might be able to do in terms of changing their denomination to open themselves up to the future. And it was just the level of dynamism and intelligence of conversation, and sitting there and watching Phyllis, who was then in her mid 70s, with so much energy, um, introducing these mostly 50, 40, and 50-year-old leaders who were there at the for the Episcopal Church, getting them to be not afraid of the future, was an astonishingly beautiful thing, especially when I remember her saying very clearly, she said, "I am not going to be here to see this, but you will be." And she just encouraged people to, um, do it well, and do the future with heart, and to not back down from the challenges that face them. And so all of that combined, her as a writing mentor, her as a friend, her as a kind of a substitute mom figure at a really important point in my own life, um, her ability to help me professionally navigate the publishing world, um, was was so beautiful, and it changed the course of my life, and I'm really grateful, to her for that. And the most wonderful thing is I'm sitting here and I can tell you that there's probably at least, 8, maybe 12 other writers who you love who could say the same thing, because she had this enormous capacity to have a lot of children, and she actually did have a lot of children. She had 7, one of who died when, I think it was a girl who was younger, but 6 survived to adulthood. And so, her open-heartedness and her ability to take on the challenges of thinking ahead and framing the future for those who would follow her, I think was astonishing and beautiful. And so there was Phyllis on that side of me, and then I wanted to just at least mention Marcus Borg, because he was one of my closest friends at this exact same time, and Marcus and I would do things together as well, but we would ne I don't think we ever did anything. No, we did nothing where it was like me, Marcus, and Phyllis. It was over here, it would be me and Marcus, and usually, Brian McLaren or, John Dominic Crossan or someone else, when we had a 3rd or 4th or 5th partner who was into, doing an event with us. So over with Marcus, I was teaching on much of the same material out of my books. But Marcus would pull me more into thinking about church history, very specifically, the area that I was trained in, and also how church history could be revisioned for a different kind of church for the future. So both he and Phyllis were thinking about a church for the future. But Phyllis was thinking about it in sort of particular ways related to trends and generational changes and what she would call the great emergence. And Marcus was thinking about it in terms of how do you navigate a tradition into the future? How do you take what has been the beautiful texts and stories and insights and wisdom of the past and really put sort of new contours around those things and take the intellectual life seriously and the scholarly life seriously, and then press that into shaping a new church. And so Marcus was interested in those kinds of issues and really sort of, like I said, sort of pulled that out of me as a scholar, and was always reminding me of my training and the gift that I had been given by the academy. And as I was moving more and more into being just into being a public figure and not a person who was teaching in a university, um, to figure out what it meant to be a genuine public intellectual, public theologian, a person whose life would not be in the academy, but a person who taught in the world. And that's really where his heart was, as his career was in its final phases as well. He loved his students. He was grateful for his students. He taught, until, gosh, he was like 67 or maybe only a few years before he passed away. He also died in 2015, as Phyllis did. And Yet he got to the point where his favorite place to teach, and I know this is true, his favorite place to teach were the churches that invited him to come and share. He loved to preach, he loved to lead workshops, he loved talking to lay people, he loved introducing people to biblical criticism. He loved the questions. I never saw anybody who loved spontaneous audience questions as much as Marcus Borg did. And so to work with him was a joy because it was literally watching a master teacher at work, and not a master teacher like teaching in the halls of Yale Divinity School, but a master teacher teaching in a sanctuary at First Congregational Church in wherever we happen to be together. And so that was the other part of me, was the person who was driven by the academic questions and thinking about things like methodology and caring about new research and trying to figure out how in the world do you talk about some of these things in congregations to help them reimagine the traditions they've inherited. And so the two sides of Diana got two different patron saints. Um, Phyllis and publishing and the warmth of being a mom and thinking about family and the future and what it means to pass on a church to a new generation of people. And really, it was from Marcus's side was a kind of an academic mentorship that I never had in the academy. Interestingly enough, but I had it outside of the academy, and he wasn't thinking so much about creating a church for the future that those generations could be inherited or could inherit. But Marcus was really interested in how can we take what we have from the past and make sure it lives and sings into the future. And so while Phyllis was thinking about developing sort of a new capacity of churches to welcome future generations, Marcus was more interested in thinking of how do we take what we've known in the past and ensure its continued relevance and beauty as we all move into the future. It's a slight difference there. And it was a difference that I needed, and I needed people on both parts from both parts of my life, the futurist and the historian. I mean, that's the easiest way to say it. And I think that, I hope at least years from now, if people remember what I do, and don't know how to explain it, because I don't always know how to explain it. That might be the simplest way of explaining it. She was influenced by Phyllis Tickle and Marcus Borg, and she turned out to be a futurist and a historian. She was a writer who loved the future and could see it coming, and yet always wanted to make sure we had the right things in our sort of backpacks from the past as we moved forward in time. And so those two people, they were 8 years apart in birth. Marcus was the younger one, and he died first in January of 2015. Phyllis, excuse me, was born in 1934, and she died in, I believe it was September of 2015. That was one of the hardest years of actually my life. I was no good in the fall of 2015. It was very hard to do anything because I was really grief stricken by the loss of the pair of them.
Wow.
I think about them still almost every day.
Yeah. I I I I love how personal that was. And um okay, I know we don't normally ask follow-up questions, but there's not like there's people on the live stream when we're recording this for me to have to voice their questions. So Tripp's going to use his own. Um, uh, One of the things I remember most about Phyllis, and she was very similar and encouraging to me, not in the, uh, not as intimate and such, but um, is her laugh.
Oh my
Phyllis
gosh.
had grade A laughing, and it was one that she could use where you where everyone was invited to join her, and even if you were what animated the laughter, you didn't feel laughed at.
Mhm.
That is the the thing about Phyllis that has stuck out to me the longest. And if people you can just search YouTube and watch her talk. If people in the class don't know Phyllis, if you go on the Homebrewed website and type her name in, you can listen to multiple conversations. But the last one, when we did a live podcast with when her last book in the trilogy came out, book release thing, and she was speaking at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, and then we were going to do a podcast after it. But Fuller, the no alcohol policy. So we used the UCC church that's on the campus,
Oh yeah, sure. It's right across the street there.
and she uh I homebrew, so I made her a beer where I had ordered wood planks from Jack Daniel's factory, and then sawed it up, and then made a chocolate porter, and then set it and aged it on the Jack Daniel barrels. Because she's sitting there, she's like, Trip, now it'd be hard for me to be polite. I don't really like beer. I'd much prefer Jack. I'm like, don't worry, you have to try this. I'm so excited. And she sips a, she's like, so what did you stick in this? And I was like, what do you think? She's like, it's dark like a dark beer, but it tastes like my friend Jack. And I was like, yes. And so she ended up sitting there drinking it and liking it. And Tony Jones, who had organized it, he's like, that was my favorite beer you ever made. And turned out it was about 18% alcohol, so it was pretty close to Jack, But anyway, but I just remember that night where people would ask her these attack questions, and then she would like talk back to them, unpack their assumptions, tell a story, start laughing, and now that person's laughing, even though we all know that she kind of said, "No, honey."
You're a jerk.
Yeah,
I watched her do that to a couple bishops in the Episcopal House of Bishops without the jack. But who knows? I could have been in her room.
yes, yes.
Yeah, she was great. And the laughter, that's one of the pieces that I remember
Hmm.
too. And then there was this other mode that she had, and maybe it was just more on a more demonstrated on the personal level, but she also had a whisper that was really profound. I remember this one event we were doing at St. Philip's Cathedral together in Atlanta, and we were sitting at this on this big stage, and it was during the time everyone thought the Episcopal Church was about to split in half over Gene Robinson, and there were probably about 700 or 800 people in the audience. It was really big, and someone from the audience raised their hand, asked some question about the death of the church and this, that, and the other thing, and I answered the question in this case. I said, I don't think I've ever heard so many people in one Q&A session who have who claim they believe in the resurrection be so worried about the death of their church. And next to me, Phyllis, just under her breath, she went, damn, I wish I would have said that. She just whispered it real low with that southern damn, damn girl. And she would say that. She had just this sort of perfect southern whisper of swearing that she would only kind of let out at very specific times, but it was always really effective. And so she literally took my remark and underscored it and did it in such a way that it was like, "Oh, I got caught off mic," but it was totally purposeful
Yeah.
and encouraging and just wanted to get her word in. It's like, "Yeah, right. We supposedly believe in the resurrection. What are you people, complaining about?" And so that style that she brought into things too, that perfect sort of Tennessee
Mhm.
accent with the swear words just at the right places.
Yeah, she would do the she would send me email that would just be her commentary on a podcast episode. And I'm thinking to myself, "Well, what was the situation that's happened, where you're it just says, 'Hi, Trip,' and then the comments, PT." And, uh, and they were always entertaining because it was either, she wanted references for what we were discussing. It was like, "So where did you and that guest go? And you referenced this thinker or this thing, like, where was that?" And she wanted to follow it up. Or she's like, "I cannot believe you did not ask them this. It is a failure of your duty as the host that you did not ask a follow-up." And, that kind of thing. So one of the times we did the podcast, she said, uh, I don't remember whatever we were talking about, and she gives this answer, and I'm excited now about wherever we're going. And I said, "Ooh," and I start talking, and she goes, Trip, hold on. You don't have to pretend to ask me a question. Just say whatever it is you're thinking. I have a hard time following it if I think you're trying to ask me something. But if it's just Trip telling me his ingenious responses to something I said, I'll enjoy it more." And I was like, "All right, Phyllis, but it's just this, I'm interviewing you." Yeah. Sometimes you should stop that. You have your own voice now. You've done enough of these. You should get to tell us what you think. You don't have to hide it in the form of a question. But go ahead.
Ah, good for
And
her.
but she did it in front of people, right? But she knew, since it was a live event that was a homebrewed thing, that everyone there would be like, "Yeah, yeah, just tell us what you said." And then after it, she goes, "I hope you noticed they were as interested in what you thought as what
Mhm.
I was saying. At some point, you'll be a real theologian for the public and trust that." And it was like this like Southern grandma goading
Mhm.
into trusting what's there. Like, it was a different tactic, but it so resonates with the kind of, uh she was a wonderful talent scout for public theologians, and then
Yes, she was.
would kind of help them see themselves as a vessel for the Spirit before before you internalize it.
Yeah. I
And I think that is a very important gift that you don't get if you just read all of her works, um, which are wonderful. Like, it's weird we haven't talked about like these big ideas that completely changed so many of our friends' lives. We were just talking about that. We're like, she did really big stuff. It's really cool, but listen, she's also like an amazing friend and mentor.
Yeah. And well, that was the part in a sense that is to me, the sainty part is the it affects the relational part. And sometimes, people will ask me, "Well, why did you use the word saints, and what do you think of as a saint?" And I don't I think of people that have influenced me most from church history or from the pantheon of saints, not as people who necessarily had great ideas, but as people who I consider friends. And there's something that becomes, even if it's a person lived 200 years ago or, 500 years ago or whatever, there's something that is relational that comes down through what remains of them, usually their writings. That's what we have, or remembrances from other people about them. But there's something that's sort of living and pulsates through what is left of their memory in the world, and that I connect with it. And that's the kind of people that become, for me, saints. I don't like Karl Barth. Karl Barth will never be a saint of mine. And it's not saying that Karl Barth didn't write great books, or that he didn't influence 20th century Christianity, or that, there aren't people who do hold him as saints. There is absolutely nothing warm or connective that I ever find about Karl Barth. I read the books and I think to myself, I don't want to have a beer with this guy. And so I just like
Well,
so he's not in my group, my list. And to me, that's part of the quality of saintiness that we've been talking about. Is that who is it that you see in history as a friend,
mhm.
and that you think that you want to introduce your friends to as well? And so to me, that's Phyllis. I mean, that was just Phyllis through and through. So
So, so one last question is, now let's imagine people um are like, "Ooh, I think I want to hang out with Phyllis and Marcus," but they hear the stories of how this historian and futurist tag team um became patron saints of sorts for you. What are the things they could, like, where would you point them in their work, or the big ideas where if they wanted to meet the other side of the story of Phyllis, like her work, like what are a couple of those ideas, or the other side of Marcus, where would they go?
well, I think that it's sort of intriguing. That's a great question to ask, by the way, Trip. Um, Phyllis is best met through video, and her ideas, I think, are best listened to. Um, she was an incredibly good writer, and she wrote some really interesting and good books. I think my favorite is The Great Emergence. I remember saying that at the time when she sent me the manuscript. I said, "Phyllis, this is gonna be the best-selling book of your life." And it was. And so there was something about that book that just sort of reaches beyond its pages and grabs the imagination, in some of the ways that her other things don't necessarily do. Even though I've read, her autobiographical pieces and her prayer pieces and other things like that. I think that Great Emergence captures something about her. It's really important. But videos always do that. Her laughter, the warmth, the ideas, the spontaneity of her imagination, all that stuff is in those videos. And so I would just Google her, and look for what's still there from YouTube, and see what she was talking about wherever with whoever. And she really, really, really liked Bob Abernathy, who was for years the chair, not the chair. Excuse me. I'm thinking about academics ahead with Marcus Borg. He was the broadcast genius behind Religion and Ethics News Weekly. So he was a journalist, and he was also just the guy who did most of the big interviews. And so if you can find stuff that Phyllis did with Bob Abernathy, their friendship and their trust of each other communicates itself across the screen. And she said a lot of really important stuff when she was in conversation with him, and on Religion and Ethics News Weekly. So I'd start there. Now, see, with Marcus, it's just the exact opposite, is that Marcus communicates better in writing. And I think it's because he was really quite an introvert. And so he thought about what he put on the page. And it just sort of the page pulled everything out of his heart. And the three books that I think are his best, maybe 4. Certainly, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, it's short, it is revolutionary, it will change anybody who's on the verge of deconstruction. It will turn you inside out backwards and make you think about life all over again. Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, The Heart of Christianity, which is his book about the shape and future of Christianity. And that's the one that he and I were on the road mostly talking about, that and Christianity After Religion together. Those books came out kind of close to each other in time. A book called Convictions, and that was the last book he wrote about the things that he really believed in his life. And then I can't remember the name of that other book. It was a book he wrote about reimagining all of the different terms of Christianity. I'd have to go and look at that. Do you remember
I think
that
it's
that
called The
book?
Grammar of Faith, or it's Speaking Christian.
Speaking Christian, that's it.
Grammar of Faith is Paul Homer, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was influenced by him. So yeah, Speaking of Faith, that is a really good book. And if you, again, for people who are reimagining what it means to be Christian, all you need to do is go to that book and look up a word like sin and turn to that chapter, and there's like 8 pages. I mean, it's so concise. It's beautiful. And he will help you understand sin from what I think are better, more informed biblical perspectives. And so Marcus communicates through the page, and Phyllis through video. And some of the pieces that are left from Marcus are really good too. And Marcus knew how to laugh as well, and did. And the but the thing that rings in my ear from Marcus is that he was a upper Midwesterner. He was from Minnesota, and he kept that sort of Minnesota accent, well, just a little bit all through his whole life. And whenever he would get really excited about something, and he really agreed with an idea, he'd go, "Yup, yup, yup, yup." And so we have this little fun thing we do at our house, and then we go, "Yup, yup, yup." And, and whenever either Richard or I do it, we just laugh because we know we're just sort of imitating Marcus, 'cause, he was a very important friend to both of us. So, the Southern Tennessee, sort of Tennessee lady who drank Jack and swore versus the very well sort of educated Oxford Donish Marcus Borg with the really kind of goofy sort of Minnesota accent under it all, who loved church basements and Jello salad, ba
Yeah.
basically until the day he died, and the Bible. I never knew anybody that loved the Bible more than Marcus Borg.
Yeah, as much as more conservative Christians could have a problem with his own wrestling with the text and where he ended up, you wouldn't end up keeping a straight face or finishing a paragraph if it meant he didn't take it seriously. And I think
Mhm,
that is something that is worth reminding ourselves for those that are struggling with cynicism in this historical moment, that one of the things that makes you uh, a goad that could ultimately become a gift to those that you experience on the other side of very important issues is that your proclamation of for Marcus, which was his wrestling with how Jesus understood the kingdom of God,
mhm.
um, meant he wasn't going to set the text or tradition aside. He was going to honor it by wrestling with it.
Yep.
And if you were going to dismiss him, you would have to wrestle with it as much as he did. And I think that that is something, especially with the way our attention is shaped and our communication has been reshaped with social media, that a lot of those that kind of get the most attention for voicing their exodus from conservative Christianity it could learn from Marcus that you don't see prevalent as often.
Yeah. I guess, and just the last thing to say in Marcus's, kind of defense is there are a lot of people who say, "Oh, he didn't believe in the resurrection." And I literally watched I was on stage with him one time when he and Tony Jones had this terrible argument in public at the Washington National Cathedral about the resurrection. And Tony literally did not understand what Marcus was saying and kept mischaracterizing it. And Marcus was so desperate to try to communicate it to Tony that he actually did believe in the resurrection. And to see these two just sort of go past each other, and it was enormously frustrating and maddening for me, because I know that Marcus actually did believe in the resurrection. He believed it in the fact that he trusted that story, of Jesus being raised from the dead, the stories of him appearing to the disciples were so important that they were there in the scripture, that they recorded the experiences of of early Christians who treasured whatever it was that happened after Jesus' death. That Marcus felt that experience was something that he could trust too. And just because he didn't want to say, like most historians, I mean, this is, people say the same thing of me. Most historians don't want to say, yes, I think that this was a historical actual event. We can't say that on the basis of how we're trained, because we don't have any evidence for it. That is what you would call reliable historical evidence. We can't make claims like that. Historians are too humble to make claims like that. And that's what Marcus remained to the end of his life. He really was a historian, who was a biblical critic. I'm a historian who does American 19th century history. But historians can't make claims for which they have no recognized evidence. But what we can say is that whatever this thing was had a huge impact, and that we see the traces of that impact rippling out through time and history. And that if something has enough sort of ripples and traces, then you can then I think fairly, as a believer, as both Marcus was and I am, you can say, I am willing to trust whatever happened back then as something that is meaningful for my life and the continuing life of the people of God in the world. And so that's a really interesting way of conceptualizing and talking about the resurrection. And I think it's a great tragedy that for some reason there are people sort of in the next generation down of biblical scholars who just look at like Dom and Marcus and say, oh, they don't believe in the resurrection. Listen with better ears. That's all I can say, is that they Marcus in particular trusted the resurrection maybe more than most of the people I know who go up there and blab all the time about how they believe in historical, literal raising of the dead of Jesus. Marcus really trusted whatever that experience was and embraced it incredibly deeply in his own life experience. And that taught me a lot. And it kept me from becoming cynical or skeptical or rejecting the idea of a resurrection. In effect, I think that Marcus saved me from some of the agnosticism that just riddles, especially the ex-evangelical community.
Mhm. I that Marcus describing what faith in the resurrection meant. I read Meeting Jesus Again for the first time in college right after 9/11, when I'm having a crisis of faith about how ridiculous the church looked and its Islamophobia, warmongering, all this kind of stuff. I read the book. My roommate read it. We're talking about it. Then we drive to Charlotte to Myers Park Baptist Church to see him give the lecture series on Jesus
Oh my
over the
gosh.
weekend. A lecture series I gave about my first Jesus book 15 or 12 years later. And one of the hosts for vacation Bible school, this adult vacation Bible school this summer for Homebird, but I didn't even connect those dots till the story popped in my mind.
Oh
But
my goodness, that's a
I
great
had that
story, Trip.
question, right? Like the kind of question you have as a Baptist and blah blah blah. And and he could tell it was not a got you question.
Mhm,
And he said, well, um, what does it mean to trust the resurrection? In part means that you're trusting the one Jesus called Abba, and
mhm,
you're trusting the message of Jesus. And at the base of the kingdom of God, the proclamation of the kingdom of God is that the world is currently in darkness, and that deals death to those God loves most.
yep,
And if you recognize the world is the powerful are in darkness, and then you have to ask yourself, well, what hope is there? And it's that point that you're perfectly okay giving yourself to the light, not of the sun, because you can't see it, you're in darkness, but the moon. And he said, the resurrection is like the light of the sun being reflected on this world. You cannot stare directly at the sun. It's not something my historian's eyes know how to do. But if
mhm,
you ask me, as someone who trusts in the resurrection, if I will fail but give myself to living by faith in a world of darkness, because the light of that sun is reflected on a moon, experienced at the table, found in the mouth and limbs and flesh of Jesus and his church today, then yes, and I believe that. But I think you misunderstand how the question, and he goes on saying that the question's normally framed in a way that doesn't see the world as Jesus did, dominated in this way. And then we ask the question where we're asking for an answer we don't even have the ability to do, right? The historian can't look directly at the sun. The historian doesn't know that. But have you found more life trusting the light of the moon in a world that's dark? And I was like, oh hell yeah. Go ahead. Give me Easter Sunday, because I will just steal it. And
I'm preaching that sermon.
I know, but I loved it. The reflection of the moon, the sun, and I'm like using the
Yeah.
historian's eyes, and I'm like, oh, that's
Yeah,
awesome.
it's I didn't know that he had said that to you, and, I mean, that's exactly where I went in my comment, is that as a historian, there are certain things that you cannot say, because there's certain things you oops, I just knocked my whole thing over here. There's certain things you can't say because you just you can't see them, you
Hmm.
know? You can't look there because there's nothing there. I mean, and I love what he said, you can't look at the sun. In effect, that that would blind you, among other things in putting that in spiritual frame. Historians are actually very humble people, and we actually look for what can be truthfully said, and then when we know what can be truthfully said, we proclaim those things, we trumpet those things. And so, there's a kind of a cautiousness about what can be seen directly and what can only be seen through a glass darkly, as it were. And so I'm really glad that you remember that. That's a gift to me. So thanks a lot, Trip.
Oh, well, this has been quite a bit of fun, quite a bit of fun, and the what's fascinating when you talked about Marcus and the way you talked about Marcus and Phyllis in the role they played, it was different, encouraging, and helped you. Like that is very like there's striking parallels between my relationship with you and Brian, and you're in the generation of my parents. I think you're too cool to be boomers as well. I think Phyllis and I may have similar thoughts about that generation as a whole. But in that kind of friendship, encouragement, like the instructive, challenging voice thing, y'all have both been that to me. And I imagine Tony Jones would be my antagonizing older brother who was doing it because he loved me deep down. Um, but the we joked about during the 9/11 class how many people were like, "Oh, it's Diana and Brian. It's my other mom and dad." That in my generation, so many people have experienced, and I think it's because, like, even like you're right, like spiritual memoirs became a very dominant space for thinking for so many people because, or here's my theory, is because fewer and fewer people are actually biblically literate enough or familiar with church history enough for those narratives to be the place they touch the divine. But we have started to treasure more and more the particular narratives of a person. And you are the authority of your own narrative. So when you're able to tell your story vulnerably, honestly, and woven with threads of grace and the Spirit, then we have the ability to trust those threads that are there. Just like just like you said, how Phyllis taught you how to observe the world around you and then recognize that the Spirit's there and trust the timing. I think spiritual memoirs have the ability to do that. You did it in telling your own story, and most people initially met Brian by him telling fictional stories, which are
His own
only
life.
only as fictitious as a preacher. It's as fictitious as every story a preacher tells. It's probably
Yeah.
too true, and so therefore it can't be too accurate.
And that's sort of, if you talk about the familial sort of narrative here of the patron saints, it's like Marcus and Phyllis were my spiritual parents in that sense. Um, they were for Brian too. And
Mhm,
and he has a couple others that, wouldn't be on my list, but that the 4 of us would pal around together, in the early aughts and, up until the time both of them passed away in the teens. Um, and that we would trade off, sometimes it would be like Brian and Marcus doing something and maybe Phil's doing something over here. And sometimes on the same weekends, the pairings would be in different places. And occasionally it would be the three of us out of the four doing something together. And so the influences that we had on one another. And I constantly say Brian's like my brother.
mhm.
Brian's like my older brother. And uh, I'm very grateful for that.
But, Brian was nice before he got in his 50s. I told Tony it took him to getting in the 50s before he became nice. Now, I have to, like, bribe him to give me a hard time on the podcast. I'm like, "No, Tony, Pete." On the 15th anniversary live stream, I was like, "I need you to be a dick again." Like,
Ah,
it's fun. Like, I won't take it I did it for years. You would just come on and ride me. I need you to do it again. He's like, I just
he's been
somehow.
through a lot, that
Yeah,
poor
he's like, "I
Tony
don't."
Jones.
I was like, "I'll do it if you want me to." And luckily, he didn't forget how. It was still in there. I was like, "Man, you didn't have to do that well."
That's what I always say to Brian. I say, "We're like brother and sister, but the problem is people don't expect it, is that you're the nice one." 'Cause I got edge, and
No way.
I don't put up with stuff sometimes. And, and Brian will just smile and I look at him and go, "How do you do that?" It's part of it is, women have to be a little bit more assertive sometimes and self-protective. And then as soon as you do that, then you're, the B word. So, but Brian never. Brian is so sweet. I just like, "Oh, how can you be so nice? People push you around so much, you know?"
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
I it's true.
but patron saints can't be your brother.
Yeah,
That's a whole different relationship. So,
and it's
but you
good to
know
have
what?
both.
You need to talk
Oh, yeah.
about your guy.
Well, here, let's stop this recording and then start again so they'll
Okay.
be separate. And I
Okay.